many of you may well know, are probably the world's leading supplier of coating-related instrumentation. And as part of that sort of position in the marketplace, we do take quite seriously the issue of looking at where the industry is and trying to think about areas where we can develop. And one of the things I always say is that if we're making, or if we're trying to sell quality control instrumentation, nobody buys it because they want it. They buy it because they're either forced to by a standard they're working to, or the gauge or the instrument will give them information that they need to do something or part of their role. And we treat literally those words very seriously, because the way that we look at it is that in any kind of process, and look at the coatings application process, it goes through a series of iterative areas. We look at any one of those and try to do the best that we can in terms of offer accurate instrumentation, quick instrumentation, reliable instrumentation, and they tend to be built around the current way of doing things. But there's a chicken and an egg scenario, and this is the perfect example of that. What I want to talk to you about tonight is that when you've got a chicken and egg scenario, something has to break, something has to come first. And with regard to measurement of surface salt contamination on a steel surface prior to coating, the industry's worked in a particular direction for so many years, blindly following one ISO standard, without sitting back and thinking what it is that you're actually doing. And it's that thought process element that I want to raise with you tonight. First of all, I'll talk about kind of what's been going on in the past, and then just raise that question, then offer a solution to you. And hopefully, over the next sort of half an hour or so, that process of questioning what we do now, looking at potential alternative, understanding the benefits of that alternative, and then working with that alternative, shows a sensible direction for the marketplace. Now, as you all know, if you're involved in any kind of inspection, you're working to standards. What I said a couple of seconds ago about everybody blindly following the ISO 8502 standard, it is literally that. And so when you do something new that breaks away from a particular way of doing things, how do you do it? Because either you change the standard first, or you create a solution first, which then forces the change to the standard. Now, changing the standard first is very difficult, because if you change the standard without a solution to work to the new standard, what was the point? And there's a classic example of that. A few years ago, you'll be familiar with the 25mm wide tape that you might stick onto a surface for removing loose cross-coat adhesion tests. And the industry decided that it wanted to move, or the standard bodies decided it wanted to move from a 25mm wide tape to a 50mm wide tape, because it felt it was a better direction. So it changed the standard. No one thought to go to the tape manufacturers and say, can you make that for us? So when they went to the tape manufacturers after they changed the standard, you can guess what the answer was, can't you? Sorry, can't have that. Quite literally, because the coating industry takes that much tape in a market that's like that, so we can't tell them what to do. And so we thought about that example and thought, if we're going to try and change the way people think about measuring salt, we've got to put the solution on the table first, and then go to the market, and go to the standard people, explain the benefit, and have them then follow. And what's been really interesting, just to whet your appetite, Graham referred to a couple of times that I've done this presentation before. A few weeks ago, I was in Saudi, and Saudi Arabia, strange country, but nevertheless, they're very much dominated by the national oil company, Saudi Aramco. And Saudi Aramco follow the standards, but also, very intelligently, they also have a coating committee in their company that looks at standards and says, yeah, we'll follow that. But if something else comes along, they listen to it, hear about it, and make a decision based upon what they see. And the reason for saying this is that the culmination of that evening presentation, much like we're doing tonight, there were two gentlemen from the Aramco Coating Committee in the room. The chairman and the retired chairman. They're the top two guys in the whole country. And they were really interested in this. So I did some demonstrations with them afterwards. We had dinner and all that stuff. And the conclusion was that Aramco have now changed the specifications as a result of this kind of gathering. Now, I'm not expecting that we get that kind of result tonight, don't misunderstand me, but it does show the value of having these kind of events, that having that knowledge put out into the marketplace and people understanding it, discussing it, talking about it, can be very beneficial. Okay, so enough of the introduction. What are we going to talk about? Well, I'm going to break the evening down into a series of sort of bite-sized manageable chunks, and we'll talk quickly about chloride salt determination. We'll talk quickly about the two main test methods. And if anybody's got any questions about those, please do stick your hand up. Because some of the things that I say are related, Tammy, because we often argue, are related to the way that we see things. And what's really nice for me, and obviously probably more interesting for you guys as well, is to have a debate going. If somebody really doesn't agree with what I've said, or any aspect of it, or you want some further clarification, yeah, put your hand up, we'll talk about it. There'll also be an opportunity for questions at the end. But you know what that means. At the end, you've forgotten what the question that you wanted to ask, and it seems it seems slightly irrelevant to the end of the day then. Okay, so we'll talk about the next stage, is understanding those two current methods, and then developing, sounds very simple, but developing an equivalence between the two. I'll explain that further in a second. Then we'll talk very quickly about the limitations of what those methods are, and then we'll talk about what we've done as a business to overcome those limitations and how easy it is to understand the solution that we're putting in front of you. And then we'll draw some conclusions. So essentially, that's what we're talking through. Introduction is very easy. Soluble salts, it says up there, can result in premature corrosion leading to coating failure. I think we all know that. The next point is absolutely critical. This is something that there's a real misconception in the marketplace about. That second sentence, soluble salts are not uniformly distributed, and they form crystals on a surface. Now, what is he on about? I'm going to be very simplistic, guys, and imagine that was a piece of steel, clean steel, that you blasted. If you put it into that swimming pool outside and take it out of there and put it on the side of the pool on a nice warm day, what will happen? The water on there will evaporate. Yeah, we all know that. What will it leave behind? Most of the people think it will leave behind a salty surface. Well, yeah, it does. But in what format? What does it appear like? If we could have X-ray salt vision to see it, what would we see? We'd see, all right, you can read. We would see crystals, but why? I mean, the answer is, the issue is, that we don't see a uniform area of salt on that surface. Because during the evaporation process, what happens, those salt molecules form together. As the water's evaporating, those salt molecules can move around. And they form together through ionic bonding, some chemical thing that I don't quite understand. They form together through ionic bonding into crystals. In other words, they form little concentrations. And in between those concentrations, they form areas of very low concentration. So we effectively get the occasional mountain separated by big deserts. When I say big, a few millimeters. And you'll think, how does he know that? Well, I'll tell you how I know that. You all know it. Because imagine that piece of steel. If I left it on the side of that pool for a couple of days, what would happen? We'd start to get pinpricks of corrosion. Wouldn't we? We all know that. And eventually those pinpricks of corrosion would grow and the whole surface would be corroded. But it initiates as pinpricks of corrosion. And those pinpricks are where the maximum concentration of those crystals are. And, okay, haven't you ever thought about that before? Put it like this, before we started this development, I certainly hadn't. So it's not an embarrassing thing to say that you'd never thought about it before. But just keep that thought in your mind. There are currently two main test methods. The results from those two methods, they are the Bressler patch, by the way, and the saturated filter paper method. All the other iterations are versions of the Bressler patch. It's the same philosophy. I'll explain what those are in a second. But the results from the two methods are not comparable. Why? Well, the difficulty with any kind of testing like this, salt testing, actually, daft as it sounds, is destructive. Because if you put a Bressler patch onto a surface, put some water inside it, it then dilutes the salt that's on that surface and removes it, leaving behind a nice clean surface. If you put the filter paper test on that surface, it does pretty much the same thing. It extracts all the salt. So you can't go back and test again the area that you've just tested to prove that they are equivalent. And so there's never been a method that allows us to prove it, which means it's very hard to prove whether the two methods are comparable or not. And so the assumption has been that they're not, because you can't prove that they are, if you understand my logic. Both methods, importantly, provide average values. Now, those of you who are familiar with using the filter paper method, which this is the great Blue Peter thing that you should have prepared the sample earlier. But if we have a filter paper, what happens, we wet that, put it onto the surface, we wait a couple of minutes, it absorbs through capillary action all the salt that's on that surface into the paper, and then the salt uniformly distributes itself into the paper through osmosis, so the top and the bottom is going to give the same value. So you've extracted all the salt from that surface, and then you put that onto your gauge, and you get one value, the average. Using the Bressler patch method, similar thing. You inject water into a patch, you dissolve all the salt, you remove it, you put it on a conductivity meter, and it gives you one value, the average. We've already discussed partly this issue about crystals. So both methods are fundamentally flawed, because they are giving you only an average, they're not identifying where these concentrations are. More of that later. So what it says on the bottom there, no tests show any kind of salt distribution, they just give an average. So there are two methods, Bressler patch, that's compliant with the ISO 8502 and SSPC guideline 15. The second method, the saturated filter paper method, is compliant with SSPC guideline 15. It is not compliant with ISO 8502 because no one can prove it. Interesting point. Both of them measure averages, and because of that no one can prove it issue, results are not historically comparable. The Bressler patch, those of you who aren't familiar, I presume many of you are, is 1,250 square millimeter patch. It's small, it's about 1.5 inch square area, and adhesive patch applied to a surface. We inject water using a needle, and we agitate that water, we mix that water with the contaminant that's on the surface enclosed within the patch, and if we follow the standard properly, we have to do manipulation of the content of the patch to ensure that we dissolve all of the salt that's in that localized area. We then remove it, we put a drop onto a conductivity meter, and it gives us a value in micrograms per centimeter squared or milligrams per meter squared. Please, everybody, please, 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 if someone says to you, I want to measure salt contamination in microsiemens, say no, because microsiemens is a measure of conductivity. Salt contamination is linked to an area of testing. So you must get your microsiemen value and adjust it according to the area that you're testing on. So microsiemens is purely a conductivity reading. A measurement of salt contamination is micrograms per centimeter squared or milligrams per meter squared. Just a point of note. Finally, lots of alternative copy type patches available. Elcometer have original Bressler patches, and we've got our new one, which is quite an attractive price, but nevertheless, they're all verging on very much the same thing. The second method, historically, uses a gauge that you can see in the corner there, and it's got a CD-sized filter paper that I showed you before. We drop 1.6 millilitres of water, very carefully, deionized water, clean water, onto that patch, onto that paper. We put that paper on the surface, we run it for 2 minutes, and the absorption time, significantly quicker than the Bressler patch method, we'll note, guys. Absorbs through the, as I said, through capillary action, filters salt from the surface, and we can put it onto the conductivity meter, which is taking one value across the average. Now, those of you who immediately say, but Craig, that doesn't work in our nice warm atmosphere apart from today, because the water on that paper will evaporate during the 2-minute cycle. Well, we finally have a solution. It's one of those. And that is, very simply, a bit of magnetic rubber. And what you do, you get your piece of paper, you wet it, you put it onto the surface, and, very difficult to demonstrate. Imagine that's our surface. What we have, we wet the patch, we wet the paper on the magnetic disc. The magnetic disc is marginally bigger than the paper. We put that onto the steel, and of course, with it being magnetic, it grips onto the steel. It's bigger than the paper, so it totally encloses it and minimizes the evaporation by some 90%. So the issue that we've always had with evaporation, do I re-wet the paper and all that kind of thing, which has been a limitation with the filter paper method, is now well and truly overcome. At the risk of doing Graham's job for him, those patches are available to buy from him. Sorry, Graham. These business cards on the corner. Okay, so move on. The thing that we had to do first, to make anybody sit up and notice, is prove equivalence between the two methods. So how on earth did we do it? Now, the difficulty is, I said to you a couple of seconds ago, that salt testing, mind your way, Andrea, sorry. Salt testing, you're supposed to say no.
Oh, no.
Salt testing is destructive. And in other words, when you do the test, you clean the area that you're testing, so you can't retest the same area. But because we know in real life, there's big variation over an area, vis-a-vis our example of the steel in the swimming pool water, it's very difficult to prove that the salt level on one area is the same as the salt level on another area. So in order to prove that these two methods can be judged to be the same, we have to create a methodology that allows us to create a uniform salt level on your test area. Because it's not natural, it doesn't naturally occur. So we created a methodology that allowed us to, took about 1.5 years of working with Manchester University in the UK. It basically allowed us to create a method of dosing, applying salt to a surface, which would mean that wherever you tested on that surface, there would be a uniform level of contamination. So the way that we did that is we worked through all different kinds of we use the current standards, the current NACE standard. We did lots of iterative work with Manchester and also with Edinburgh University, measuring the effect of surface profile according to how salt is absorbed by a surface. All that work was done, but essentially what it is, it's like a robot arm that drops little bits of salt, a couple of millilitres of contaminated water. And if you imagine you've got a table about this big, about 2 times the size of an A3 paper, so what's that, an A2 paper. We would get an A2 sheet of steel and we'd drop several thousand drops of water, but in a random fashion. And because the table's heated, you drop the water here, within a few seconds that water has evaporated, but because there's no water around it, the salt is going to form a reasonably uniform amount of salt on that tiny little area. And the next drop is somewhere over here. And the next one's here, and the next one's here, and the next one's here, and the next one's here. So eventually, after about 1.5 hours of dropping bits, we've dropped on every square millimetre of the test area, but we've never gone back to the same area or a similar area until it's been dried from before. So effectively, instead of allowing the salt to form nice little crystals, we've artificially stopped it doing so. So we've created a test area which is of uniform salt distribution. That then allows us to then take a step back and say, okay, now that we've got a standard, we've got a baseline, we can now start to develop methodology that allows us to compare the two different types of tests. We did lots of work creating lots of different methods, and we took us, let's say, a year and a quarter or something. But essentially, it's done what I've just said. And testing has been carried out once we've established this. I'll show you in a couple of seconds, a couple of slides showing what we did. But basically, testing of various levels of salt, in other words, the amount of salt in those little drops, and also having the plate to different levels of profile. So we did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tests to get some reliable baseline data. Now, the conclusion was fairly obvious, because I wouldn't be standing here in front of you if we hadn't managed to learn something from that, obviously. But the conclusion was that we created a methodology that said we could literally compare the results of a Bresler test and the filter paper test. And we therefore created a methodology that adjusts the value you get from the filter paper test to match the value that you get from the Bresler patch. And it's virtually a constant, believe it or not. It's tweaked by a couple of things, but mathematically it's virtually a constant. So we could then build into a new version of that gauge what we call Bresler equivalence number, BEN. So you can set the gauge up in that format, knowing full well that the result you get will be the equivalent to had you done a Bresler test in the same area. And that was proven by quite a series of tests, which I'll just quickly go through. Now, that's all very well. Elcometer, sorry, I'm really in your way. Elcometer standing up and telling you about that, but when you find that the US Navy, who have independently verified our results to be tighter in terms of repeatability than even we thought they were, they analyse in a slightly different way, then you've got to have some confidence that what I'm saying has got some truth in it. So, all right, I've talked about that. So when we prepare a sample, this is an excerpt from a panel, and it's easier to walk up to, sorry, can I walk over here? These are the filter papers, and these are the Bresler patches. Now in each mini area, we're taking 1, 2, 3, 4 Bresler patches and 1 filter paper, so that area there will be 1 test area. And to show equivalence, to show repeatability, those same 2 results are compared with those 2 and that one to be a different test area. And that magnifies itself over the size of the bigger panel. So essentially, we're doing, remember that the panel is dosed with equivalent salt levels across its whole area. By doing this number of tests on different profiles and different levels of salt, we can form some quite clever mathematics and quite clever results. I am not going to explain all these graphs, guys, otherwise you will really fall asleep. But essentially, we're messing around with smooth panels, 25 to 50 micron profiles, 50 to 75, and profiles above 75. Those variations, as we go through the higher salt levels, we're now up to 4 to 4.5 micrograms, up to 5 micrograms, above 5 micrograms. And we're doing a whole series of iterative testing, and that testing went up to testing around 16.5 micrograms, which is towards the top end of where you would realistically be testing salt on an uncoated surface. And we proved that doing lots of different tests, and sorry, I'll just throw that one there as well. That's the US Navy's interpretation of our data. The black line being the perfect resolution between the 2 methods, and the variation the actual results they got are in blue, and the maximum variation between the two was less than 1%. Now, our data, put into numbers, showed that we were within 3% between the two methods. The neighbour gave 1%, but if I add into that the natural variation of Bressler patches, these are the patches made by Bressler, not any copy ones, the natural variation in cleanliness of the patch before you test it is up to 0.88 micrograms. And if you're testing for 5 or 6 or 7 micrograms, 0.88 is quite a big chunk. But if the natural variation is that much, the variation in the patch alone is more than the variation that we were seeing between the methods, which is quite a compelling argument that we've got and established some kind of parity. So now, we say, and it's been reinforced by the US Navy, that it can be reasonably concluded that following extensive testing across numerous concentrations, blah, 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 the new Elcometer SSP gauge, used in its Bressler equivalency mode, which is just make the B appear on the screen, provides equivalence to the ISO2 method. Now, Peter, I'm going to ask you now. That's a very clever word, equivalence. It is not compliant with the ISO2 method, ISO 8502 method. Why? Because the ISO 8502 method calls for the use of a patch. Simple. So if you're not using a patch, you are not compliant to the standard, by definition. But if the results that you get are equivalent, then we have proven equivalence, hence the wording. Okay? Just in case anybody wanted to trip me up on that point. However, that's all well and good. What all that does is say that we can use the filter paper method with our nice little magnetic patch, or we can use the Bressler patch, but we'll still only find averages. So, okay, have we moved on? The only way we moved on is that we've now been able to establish some link between the two methods that was never there before. That's good, but it's not great. So, what is really great is the next bit. This is the bit that's really interesting, and it's a bit where we've really made a serious breakthrough. And this is the bit I want you to try and listen to. So we already said that salt doesn't form an even layer. Crystals form, blah, blah. The corrosion begins from those crystals. The current methods use an average, and the current methods do not see those concentrations. They just dilute them. So what have we done? Well, we've created a new gauge that looks like the old one, apart from the grid. Do you remember the previous one had 2 concentric rings on it, and it was taking one reading across the whole area? What we're doing now, with a bit of clever technology, we're actually taking not just one reading, we're taking 252 readings. And to try and explain that, each of those dots on the face of the gauge, so looking like this, it might be a bit clearer. Each of those dots on the face of the gauge will take a reading between itself and all the 8 surrounding points around it. So all those readings, all those points, apart from the ones on the edge, are taking 8 readings. And all of those 8 readings on each one are being plotted into a representative format that I'll show you in a second. Which, instead of taking one reading to show the average, we're now going to start to see whether variations occur on that test area. So, what's it actually look like in reality? Well, okay, there's a nice another example of the magnetic patch. That's what the gauge looks like, and that's what the screen looks like, just like any other Elcometer gauge. But this time, when you close the lid of the gauge, after you put the paper on there, the gauge takes a few seconds to react. It takes a few seconds because it's doing all that calculation. And it's then converting it into a plot which shows you graphically on that screen. Importantly, this point here. So the matrix will show individual salt levels around that whole surface area. But importantly, the accuracy of this can be verified. Special tiles that you put on the gauge, you hold them there, it assesses the performance of the gauge against what the tile is giving in terms of conductivity and compares the result with what's built into the tile. It's quite a clever way of verifying that the gauge is telling the truth.
Sorry, is it self-verified then? Do you need to send the machine in for calibration, or can you do it with?
Oh yeah, yeah. You can send the machine in for calibration.
No, I don't want to. Can I verify the accuracy myself with the tiles?
Yeah, the tiles have a known level of conductivity.
Is it a NIST certified tile? Or?
Yeah, fully certified. Yeah, fully traceable certification. The tiles have a known level of conductivity, and what you're doing by just putting them onto the gauge, it's comparing all the results of each point with all the 8 surrounding points and building a matrix and comparing with what the tile says with what the gauge says. And it does it all inside its own test method, and it comes up and says either yes or no.
As long as it says yes, you don't need to send it in for calibration.
Yeah. That's the selling point. I didn't prime him earlier, by the way. But the interesting stuff, and I'll show a couple more illustrations of this in a second, is that we start with a typical value of an average, just like we did before. And then we break it down into these 4 individual Bressler patched sized areas that appear on that test area. So in other words, the top left corner we pretend is a mini Bressler patch, or an actual Bressler patch. The top right the same, the bottom right, the bottom left. So we create average values if you were to replicate, if you were put 4 Bressler patches over that test area. And then, where it gets really interesting, and you can see from the third image, we can now show a 2D image of the relative levels of salt. And just like any other one of our products, you can introduce what you call limits. So if you've got a tolerance that above, let me say, 7 micrograms is going to be a failure, you can set a gauge limit to be 7.7 micrograms. Any reading that's above that will illustrate itself as red. And any reading below that will illustrate itself lower and lower and lower, all the way down to very green. And the really nice thing, which I'll show a couple of graphs in a second, it can do it in a 3D format. Now the 2D one is all well and good, but how red is red? How bad is it? If you get a 3D image, my goodness, you see it in a very, very clear way. Then you've got a simple pass-fail, where red would be fail and white would be pass. So, if we take a very clean piece of clean test area, we put the paper on, and we put it in average mode, it'll give us an average of 0.8. That's very, very low. If you remember what the background variation of a Bressler patch on its own can be as much as that. So, I'm just going to walk over again. And if we move on to the Bressler area, the Bressler patch area, we've now got, instead of 1 reading, we've now got 4. And we're immediately beginning to see some level of variation. In other words, that bit's a little bit saltier than that bit. The average is 0.8, just like it says here. The lowest is actually 0, and that reiterates what I was saying. The salt deserts, the gaps between the crystals, are going to be very low. They will literally be as much as very clean, perfectly clean, 0.0. The highest, even on a clean one, is 2.1 in this example. But if I put a limit in there of 7, that means that 100% is okay. This is an example. And then if we 2D it, we're seeing a slight yellow tinge here that's slightly above the green level. But basically, and there's a bit of a yellow tinge across the bottom right-hand side, and that bit down here, reinforcing those values there. And in the 3D area, you see a couple of blips. But essentially, it's pretty clean. And the pass-fail, obviously, it's all passing. If we then bump it up and add some contamination onto the surface, in this example, which is a repeat example, and you will see from the 3D image that all I did to create this, and this is a bit of a cheat, but all I did is I lifted the top of the gauge, the lid of the gauge, and just put my finger quickly on there. That doesn't mean that I'm a very dirty individual. Well, it might. But what it means is that our skin's very salty. Even when you come out of the shower, you can't stop your skin getting salty. And so just by touching it for a couple of seconds, you get an immediate bump in that area there. So the average went up to 1.5, which is still well within our tolerance of 7, but we've now got a peak at 5.2. But that's still below 7, so it's all good to go. And you're now seeing where I put my finger quite clearly, and blah, blah. But then, put my finger on it again and left it there for a few more seconds. And oh my goodness, we're now starting to see something different appear. The average is still well within our specification of 7. But the highest point, it says on this screen, greater than 10. That's an old version of the firmware. The latest version of the firmware will give you a value up to 18. So in other words, into the area, above the area where you would typically test. So we've now got the full range capability. So instead of saying greater than 10, it will give you a value up to 18. If it's higher than 18, then we've got more than just this as a problem. So from there, average 2.7, but the highest areas are well above our acceptable limit. So 5.7% of it is well above our acceptable limit. So we can immediately see in the 3D version exactly how much above the limit it is. Very, very graphic. Some of you will say on the pass-fail thing here that that red area is more than 5.7%. Actually, you're right, it is. It's been done that way just to be graphic, to show you more clearly the area that's under concern. And then we've got this pass-fail distribution graph showing a small amount is outside our spec. But all of a sudden now, you begin to see the speed at which we can begin to see where these concentrations are, which is quite powerful. So, that's how it works, that's how it does it. Don't forget, guys, that this is working by wetting that paper with, shall I do it? I do a real test. Yeah. Real tests on film are always dodgy. But hopefully this proves a level of confidence that I have in the product. What we do, we have a little syringe that's marked with little graduations, and we draw 1.6 millilitres of water, deionized water from the bottle, clever seal on the top so it doesn't leak. And we get our patch, our magnetic patch, and we very carefully, we should use gloves by the way, because our fingers are sticky and salty. We get a clean paper and we put it onto the magnetic patch, and we get our little syringe and we carefully drop the water onto the patch, taking care not to spill any water away from the patch, because that will reduce the dilution and affect the results. So it's really important that we add that water onto the patch, allow it to coat the whole patch area, and we're now left with something that looks like a wet filter paper. So I would then put that onto my test area, and if I have a steel, a magnetic patch would stick, and I'd leave it for 2 minutes. So the gauge has got the ability to, there's a little timer on it as well if you want to count 2 minutes if you're not sort of happy with using your watch or your phone or whatever. But let's assume that we've done the 2 minutes, and so make sure I've got this gauge set up properly. 1 second. I'm just resetting the gauge, so you know I've not cheated. So I've not installed some data in there to show that I've cheated. Okay, so I've reset the gauge, now it's back to its neutral condition. We then remove that, the patch, leaving the magnetic patch on the back of it. It's easier to do. We then put the paper onto the gauge, we close the lid, and those of you who've got the front or have very good eyesight, it's showing that screen that says measuring. There's a little continuity bar running across there. Come and have a play with it afterwards, by the way, guys, if you can't see from the back. So it takes a few seconds. We're about 60–70% of the way through now. This is the bit where I've got to keep talking and keep watching and seeing what it does. It takes a few seconds to complete, doing all those iterative calculations, and it displays that it's very, very clean indeed. So I'll just look at that in more detail. Last reading in detail, average 0.1. Those of you can see. Press the button to the right, it puts those 4 Bressler patch areas up again. They're all actually, one's 0.0, the others are 3 at 0.1. Press it again, I've got a 2D image that builds straight away. I press it again, and I've got a 3D image that builds straight away. Press it again, and I've got my pass-fail map. Because I haven't put any limits in there, that's just grey. Then I've got my distribution curve that shows everything is in control. And now I'm going to cheat. I'm going to replicate what I showed you on the screen before. I'm just going to lift. Andrea can verify this for me. I'm going to lift the magnetic patch. I'm going to put my fingers on the bottom right corner for 2 or 3 seconds. Close it. Oops, sorry, the wrong screen was displayed. Move the bloody paper. Right, it's going through the process again, and it'll come to its own conclusion in a few seconds' time. But hopefully, there'll be a graphic representation of my fingers on that screen. So we're almost there. Even closer now. And we've now gone from 0.1 to 0.2 as an average. Okay, it's not a lot, is it? Last reading in detail, 0.2. In fact, my fingers are quite clean. It's not, okay. You can see on there, right on the corner, where I put my fingers, you can begin to see a peak. So what I might need to do now is put my fingers on there for a little bit longer. Okay, hopefully I'm just taking a new reading. But essentially, I'll come back to that in a second. What are we learning from this? Well, the industry reaction, really from the paint companies predominantly, has been really enthusiastic. Because it's the paint guys that always get the blame when the corrosion happens. It's never the contractor that put the paint on. It's never the guy that did the blasting in the first place. It's always the paint company. So their reaction has been brilliant. Finally, we can start talking sensibly about contamination on a surface and not just making average and guesswork and all the rest of it. Also, in the grit world, it's GMA Garnet actually that I've demonstrated this to, and their reaction was, again, brilliant. We can now start to make objective assessments of the contamination that may or may not be caused by the type of grit that you use, which is quite interesting for them. But essentially what we're saying, for the first time, both average and peak salt levels on a test area can be quickly determined. And finally, as where we're going to go in the future, the paint guys will change the way that they look at it. They won't only say salt contamination to be an average of this or less. They'll say that, and they'll also say that the peak must be below this level. Because we can now test it. And that's your breakthrough. Okay, this one's finished a bit higher than it was before. And we're getting a bit of a chunk in that top right-hand corner. Hopefully, that's good. And we're now seeing, Andrea, can you now see more fingers on that screen? And more images on a 3D map? Yeah. So again, simply, quickly, it reflects what I did by putting my finger on the surface. Now, anybody who wants to have a little play with this, come and do what I did and prove to yourself that I didn't make this up. I didn't set you up at all. This is readily available now in the marketplace, so it'll do exactly what the old one did, plus all those additional advantages that I talked about. Okay, conclusions. You can read those, but essentially, Elcometer and independent testing has proven that the new filter paper method with an adjustment, this Bresler equivalency number, has proven equivalence to the ISO 8502 standard. Point number one. Testing in the way that we did it, by producing nice, evenly doped or prepared samples, has allowed us to prove that the two methods can be compared. And the latest multiple matrix array sensor that I showed you on the gauge allows the analysis of conductivity to a high resolution across the whole area. So we're finding areas where it's high, low, or whatever. Commercially available product can show it. That's the product is now on the market. Graham and Rob are doing Andrea doing a good job of introducing it to the market. If you want to see any more information, there is a video on our website. There is an Elcometer YouTube channel as well, which runs quite a nicely prepared video that kind of talks you through the pros and cons, how to do it, that kind of thing. And it runs for about 4 or 5 minutes. It's a whole lot quicker than standing here listening to me. It runs about 4 or 5 minutes, and it's quite polished in the fact that it's very clear, very concise, and to the point to explain the benefits that hopefully I've introduced you to tonight.